I love what he says. It's not enough to understand the essence of encouragement or grasp the skills essential to its success, but sooner or later we must put our classroom knowledge to the test. We must begin practicing the proven principles of encouragement in our homes, churches, neighborhoods, and businesses. It must be every day and not just Sunday. In other words, while we may be lifelong students of the book, there has to come a point in time when we put the things that we learn into practice. We're not allowed to be, for lack of a better term, perpetual students. Now, we are always to be students, but not only students. I went to Freed Harbin with some guys that were on the 7-year plan. And which, that's kind of a long time. And I've known other people stay longer. Matter of fact, I can remember when I was at Murray State back in the fall of '85. There was a guy from my hometown who was still in school. Who was, John was. Well, I graduated in '85. My cousin Sandy graduated in '80, and he was at least 2 years older than Sandy. He'd probably graduated in '78, and we were in school together, and he was still a long way from being done. His parents just happy to keep him out of the house. As long as you'll go to school and make grades, I can always remember being in school, and you had to have, I forgot what it was, like 140 some odd credit hours to graduate. And I can remember Rhonda and I, after we married, we're sitting down, we're figuring out exactly how many hours we had to have and all that. John had like 300 credit hours, and he's still going to school. But at some point in time, you have to quit going to school and put what you've learned to work. And this is the emphasis of the book from here on out. In other words, taking all the things that we've studied through these last several weeks and months, and then putting them into practice, but in view of biblical examples. And the first that we're going to see is the example of Nehemiah. And so as we think about Nehemiah, let me just, I don't know how familiar anyone is with the book. Nehemiah is a great little Old Testament book of history. It is toward the end. It is toward the end of what we know of with regard to Jewish history. The Old Testament, neither Testament is written in chronological order, right? The Old Testament, although the minor prophets are somewhat written in chronological order, but Nehemiah is at the end of the return of the exiles. And so then after that, you have your books of poetry and then your major and minor prophets, many of whom lived prior to the day of Nehemiah. And so, but Ezra and Nehemiah would be contemporaries. They would also be contemporary with a number of, for example, the minor prophets, such as Haggai and Zechariah. And so, these men all lived and worked about the same place and the same time. So I just kind of will give you a historical perspective for Nehemiah. Nehemiah was not one of the exiles. When I say exile, I mean those who were carried off into captivity and then those that got to come home. Right? Nehemiah was not among those who had gone home. After the 70-year period in Babylon that had been foretold by Jeremiah, and at the end of that, some of those folks went home. Nehemiah was not among them. He had what I would say could be a very tenuous job, but he had a very good job. He was the king's cupbearer. And of course, Artaxerxes was the king. And so basically he was a butler. He was a butler to the most powerful man in the world. And so that was his job. Now, after the exiles had returned, Nehemiah and others who had remained, in this case was in Shushan, not in Babylon, but in Shushan, had awaited reports back. In other words, some people have gone home. Now we're waiting to hear what have they done and what's going on at home. And from Nehemiah chapter 1, you hear that the reports that are coming back are extremely discouraging. Extremely discouraging. Even though the exiles went back with great excitement, they found the situation in Jerusalem to be extremely bleak. Think about this. Probably very, very few of them knew what Jerusalem looked like before it was destroyed. Now, just think about this. They'd been in Babylon for 70 years. Right? If you were, say, 12 years old, and which would basically be old enough to have any recollection of what the city looked like, you would have been 82 years old trying to make the journey back to Jerusalem. So very few of these people had any idea what they were about to witness when they got back to Jerusalem. It's one of those things that everybody thinks it's going to be great because you always have it in your mind. We're going back here and we have this idea of what it is, and then we get back and it ain't nothing. It's nothing like what we had pictured in our minds. And so immediately there is a tremendous amount of discouragement. We're not going back to a city that's just been sitting empty waiting for us to inhabit it. There's a lot of cleanup that's got to be done before we can even commence to rebuilding this thing. And so the reports came back that they were not positive. The people were not only very discouraged by what they had seen, they had no leadership. Moreover, they were, generally speaking, held in extreme disregard by the nations and peoples round about. When the Jews were hauled out, there's going to be a vacuum, all right? Because Jerusalem is Jerusalem, but the land is the land. And so there's all these individuals who come in to fill that vacuum after the Jews have been carried off into captivity. Well, they hate the Jews. The people who came in, they hated the Jews. They were glad to see them gone. And so when this bunch of ragtag exiles comes back, they're automatically discriminated against. They're mocked, they're derided. Nobody wants to help them. Nobody cares anything about them. And then you have the mental state of the exiles. They weren't living in the lap of luxury for the last 70 years either. They'd struggled to eke out any kind of existence as they were slaves in the Babylonian, and then at that time the Medo-Persian Empire. And so it's almost like I'm trying to think of the term that gets used sometimes. It has to do with prisoners that they've been incarcerated so long they've become institutionalized. In other words, all they know is prison life. Luke, you know what I'm talking about, right? And guys get out and they don't know how to function because somebody, not that jail life is great, but every day they got up and somebody fed them 3 squares and they had a place to sleep, and there was this regimen, and they've become accustomed to that, and when they get out and they're on their own, they don't know how to cope. Now you can imagine that the Jews would have had that same, they're trying to eke out an existence from day to day as slaves, people that are disregarded, and now they're even separated from what was familiar to them. And the challenge that lies before them is incredibly greater than they could have even imagined. So now this is what Nehemiah, now I'm not going to say what he inherited, this is what Nehemiah took on himself to correct. All right, so we're not just talking about like a tornado comes through and tears our church building down, and Lynn and Walter lead the way and keep our hopes up and encourage us and help us rebuild this building. No, it's nothing even remotely akin to that. All right, this is a horrible situation. And yet Nehemiah took it upon himself to make a change. That's why I love the title of the lesson, Courage to Build. Courage to Build. The account of Nehemiah. All right, and so you look down on page 108, and I've already mentioned some of this. It talks about the dreams. The dreams of the exiles. Into the first paragraph. The Jews made their way back to Jerusalem, heads filled with lofty dreams of restoring the country's former grandeur. Everything went well until they arrived home, and their plans met head on with reality. And it says that our dreams many times are much like children. Newlyweds excitedly long for the day when they can begin their families. The thought of bringing children into the world is exhilarating. Then the day comes when there's the little plus sign on the stick, and everything starts to change, and the excitement builds, and then the baby arrives, and everything is great, and then you got a baby's got colic, and then it ain't that hot, right? Those say, or you get a baby. Remember how many times got his days and nights mixed up? You ever heard that? I don't know what that means. I guess maybe he wants to stay awake all night and sleep all day. They'll just call that college baby syndrome. That'd be a lot easier. Just call it college baby syndrome. But what happens? We have all these ideas and all these dreams about what it is to be a parent, and then you become a parent and a reality set. And that's not to say it's necessarily a bad thing, but it's not something really that we envision or happens the way that we envision it. All right, and so he's comparing this process. He's comparing this process to these dreams to the birth of a child. And then over on the top of page 109, it says, bearing a child is a snap comparing to rearing one. Bearing a child is a snap compared to rearing one. By the way, there's Bible for that. John 16:21. Says when a woman, when she is in birth, is in great travail. Says, but after the baby is delivered, all that goes away because, as the Bible says, because a man-child has been brought into the world. In other words, there is a short time of travail, but that time is eventually forgotten.
That's why every pregnant woman cannot wait to get that baby out. When it's out, I wish you could put it back in. Many times you wish you could put that baby back in and go back to being pregnant.
Well, and it's still a truism that that whatever bad memories there are of giving birth, forget it, because if you didn't, you'd never have two kids. Unless you just got fortunate enough to have two at the same time the first time. All right, and so we learned that. But again, the way that it's envisioned doesn't always play out in our regular lives, and the process of raising a child is a lot longer than bringing one into the world. All right, and we all understand that. And it says, giving birth to a dream is nothing compared to sustaining it. Now, think about that. Giving birth or having a dream is not, or conceiving a dream is nothing compared to sustaining it. A lot of people have a lot of great ideas, right? And by the way, and I'm not just talking about people who have great ideas that are actually not great ideas. I'm talking about people that have genuinely good ideas. Right? But bringing that idea along and maturing it and growing it and nurturing it and bringing it to completion, again, is still a far cry from conceiving it. That's why the writer, the wise man, in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 8 said a very simple thing but very profound. The end of a thing is better than the beginning. The end of a thing is better than the beginning. I think about, maybe use Dana and Shannon as an example. The excitement of building that house. All right? Now, that's exciting. But it's not nearly as exciting, when you close the door from the inside and lock it, when you move into it. All the things that go into building a house can be great, but the greatest thing is when the house is finished. You think about, or in farming, any number of things we could think about, or even in a hobby or something. To start a project is great, and to keep it going is great, but the end of that thing is the best part, because it's all finally come together and been brought to a reality. And so as we think about having the courage to build, the end of a thing is better than the beginning. And then in the same paragraph there on 109, the first full paragraph, says, many good ideas never reach their potential because they are abandoned or neglected at a young age. In other words, when it comes time to put in the work, people oftentimes fall by the wayside. We can create a lot of excitement about a work or a program or this or that, but then when the time comes to actually execute the work and put it into practice, then people fall away. People fall away. And he makes an example, uses an example here. I'm not going to go into on page 109. But he talks about in this next paragraph on dreams, and then the last paragraph, the birth of the dream. All right, the birth of the dream. All right, now if you have your Bibles, I want you to open to the book of Nehemiah. Chapters 1 and 2 are the birth of Nehemiah's dream. And by dream I mean what he wants to accomplish. The first thing is in the process of a dream is, first of all, the perception of need. The perception of need. In verses 1 through 3, the bad report comes back. Things are not good. Look at verse 3. The survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. It's almost as if Nehemiah didn't even know the state of the city. Again, in all likelihood, Nehemiah had been born into captivity. So he had no idea what the situation was. And so it came as news to him that Jerusalem was completely and utterly destroyed. And so then in verse 4, after the perception of a need, then you have what's the second piece of that puzzle? Verse 4. What's the next thing you need to do? Once a need has been determined, what's the next thing you do? It's right, you pray. You pray. Reminded, I told you before, a friend of mine who's at one time was a deacon in a denominational church, kind of rebuked his fellow deacons after they were having a planning session. And he said, fellas, I've been sitting here listening to all this. He said, and said, there's been very little, if any, time in prayer. He said we haven't prayed to the Lord for guidance in anything. He said, this whole thing seems to me like we're going to do what we've determined we want to do, and then we're going to pray and ask God to bless it. He said that didn't make him a lot of friends, but but in his case he was right. And and any group can be guilty of the same thing. We need to pray about a matter before we pursue any kind of a plan, because you want to pray to have wisdom to start the right plan. Is that right? You want to do the right thing from the start. You don't want to just make your plans and then ask the Lord to bless what we've already determined to do. And so you have prayer is the next thing. Now in Nehemiah's case, with the situation as it was, you have in verses 6 and 7 in chapter 1, where Nehemiah freely confesses that all of this trouble is their own fault. It's all their own fault. I and my people have greatly sinned against you. We know Jerusalem didn't destroy itself. And we know that Babylon didn't destroy Jerusalem except for the fact that you permitted it. So all of this is our fault. And he says, freely, I freely confess to you, there in verse 6, both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. In other words, Nehemiah was willing to take full responsibility for the difficulties in which he and his people found themselves. In other words, he didn't blame his predecessors. He didn't blame his predecessors. That seems to be a common theme today. Well, I inherited this mess. Don't blame me. I inherited this mess. And that's not a solution to anything. In other words, Nehemiah didn't try to blame his forefathers for their situation. He included himself in that prayer. And so in his case, there was a penitence, asking of God for forgiveness. And then in chapter 2, then with the courage to build, you have what we would say is a period of preparation. Preparation. Now Nehemiah wanted to do something, but he didn't know what he could do, because of the situation that he had, for example, with his job. Well, being the king's cupbearer, the king noticed that his countenance had fallen. He said, "What is going on?" He goes, "I know you're not sick. Why is your countenance fallen?" He said, "This is nothing more than sorrow of heart." In other words, even the king could see in Nehemiah's face that his heart was hurting. And he told the king what the problem was. And so then in verse 4, chapter 2, the king says, "So what do you want? What do you want?" And what was his response? "I prayed to the God of heaven." I prayed to the God of heaven. And then he comes back with his answer. And then the king says, "Well, how long are you going to be gone?" He said, "So I set him a time." So then Nehemiah goes back with a few men and he surveys the situation. In other words, you have this first-hand or second-hand report about how things are, but you really don't know until what? Till you get there and see it for yourself. And when you get there and see it for yourself, you see in chapter 2 and verses 11 through 16, he surveyed the matter for over the course of 3 days. So there is the preparation, and then verse 17, I think there's I didn't write this down on my notes, but it's something that I thought about as I was reading, and that is the matter of promise. The matter of promise. He says, "Let's rise up and build this thing so that we are no more a reproach." In other words, people reproach us, they look down on us, they despise us. Let's work together and do something positive and remove the reproach that's come upon us over the last 7 decades. And so there's always the prospect or the promise. And so then in chapters 3 and 4 and following, you see that Nehemiah begins to build a coalition. And he begins to enlist the work of the men. I thought it was interesting. Where is it? And this to me would be discouraging, all right? In chapter 3 and verse 5. And one, by the way, another thing I love about chapter 3 is you have so-and-so did this, and next to him so-and-so did this, and next to him so-and-so did this. In other words, we're all working side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and we're working together. But think about the discouragement in verse 5. Next to them, the Tekoites made repairs, but their nobles did not put their shoulders to the work of the Lord. That's always discouraging, isn't it? Rhonda and I, when Jeffrey was playing football, there were always things that the Booster Club asked parents to do. There were certain things that we would do to help the football program. For about 2 summers, I practically lived in a fireworks. Was it 3? Ron said it's 3. Such a bad memory, I've been trying to repress it. I stayed in the fireworks stand for 3 weeks in the dead of summer, 40 to 60 hours a week. Or the cleanup on Saturday morning after home games, where you have to go clean the field house and then pick up the stadium and all that. And invariably, every single year, there were parents who were capable and had the opportunity to either work at the fireworks stand and or clean up on Saturday, that you could write it down. They weren't going to do it. They weren't going to do it. And as a general rule, the people that you knew were not going to do it, and this may be evil surmising, but my opinion was they thought they were too good to do that. They thought they were too good, to go clean the field house or pick up garbage on a Saturday morning. And that's discouraging. But you know what? Still got to get done. Still got to get done. And so you do what you can. Despite the discouragement of people that need to be working right along beside you. And so even in the course of this long list of here's a guy, here's a group of people that are working, here's a clan of people who are working, here's a clan of people who are working, their rich folks wouldn't do nothing. And then it goes right next to it. Now here's a group of people that are working, and here's a group of people that are working. But it was noted. It was noted. The nobles of the Tekoites did not put their shoulder. By the way, and look what it says. To the work what? The work of the Lord. The work of the Lord. Rebuilding that city was the work of the Lord. Because rebuilding the temple was a work of the Lord. Now, what's the lesson for us in the church? And not so much here because we're a small, tight-knit group. But I can promise you, having worked in larger congregations, there are some people that are not going to put their shoulder to the work of the Lord. And I don't mean just the nobles. Okay, there are just people who are not interested in putting their shoulder to the work of the Lord. They can show up for all the fun stuff, but when it comes time to work, AWOL. They're just not there. And so, and by the way, is that discouraging? Well, of course it's discouraging.
I think that's one thing that makes our small little church more encouraging, because like when we do our VBS, when we do a festival, it takes all of us.
I know.
Or we can't pull it off.
I know, that's why I said not so much here, because we're a small, tight-knit group. But in larger groups, people think they can just get lost in the numbers. You think about if a congregation of 300 had a door knocking effort and 100 people showed up, that would be an outstanding turnout, right? Be an incredible turnout, 100 out of 300. But it really ought to be closer to 300 out of 300. I mean, obviously you can't have the little kids and whatnot, but you understand what I'm saying. That what would generally be perceived as a pitiful turnout in the church ends up, in our minds, being a great turnout because we don't expect much out of some of our folks sometimes. And so you find in Nehemiah 3 the ability to persevere in spite of the fact that some people aren't willing to shoulder the load.
And a lot of people that don't work, like in those bigger churches, if they, you're talking about they don't put in the behind the scenes work, but they show up to the event, they're oftentimes the very ones to complain about how it came about or whatever. When had they been there during the planning or the working,
the more
their understanding of why things end up the way they do sometimes.
the more you have invested in the local work, the less likely you are to criticize it because you see it from the inside and not just from the out. All right, next week we're going to start on 111 on the determination. All right? We've talked about the discouragement, not all of it, but there's more that if you want to read in the book. But let's see. What is today? It'll be the 20th. We'll start at the top of page 111.